Okay, Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Thank you for being here, and those of you that are connected online. I hope you're enjoying your Shabbat day. At least it hasn't been too hot. It's cloudy. It's just muggy, very muggy. Okay, so today the Torah portion is called Shoftim, which can be translated as Judges, and it's found in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18 through Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 9. And the Haftarah, or the prophet, again, is Isaiah chapter 51, verse 12 through chapter 52, verse 12. And this is the fourth reading of consolation. And also a reminder that we just started the month of ELUL. And it started already the countdown of 40 days of Teshuvah, 40 days of repentance as we move towards the holidays, the fall festivals, and Yom Kippur. So this Torah portion is basically dealing with laws that have to do with justice and righteousness. And is going to speak about leaders in the judicial system, leaders in the monarchy, or if there's a king, and leaders in the spiritual sector, which is the priests and the Levites. So please go with me to chapter 16, verse 18. And it says, and I'll be reading from the Tree of Life version, just in case you want to look it up on your phone or if you have one. It says, judges and officers you are to appoint within all your gates that Adonai your God is giving you according to your tribes. So there's two types of leadership. So the name judges or shoftim is kind of a general term for leaders, but in this case is leaders that have to do with the judicial system within Israel. And the officers are going to be the ones that are going to make sure that whatever the judges say, it will be done. It's like the police force. For us, the officers will be the police force. So it says in verse 19, and again, judges and officers you are to appoint within all your gates that Adonai your God is giving you according to your tribes, and they are to judge the people with righteous judgment. Again, this has to do about righteousness and justice. And the purpose of having judges and officers is that to ensure that the behavior of both the individual and the community conform to the standards of the Torah. So the purpose of having these judges and officers is to make sure that both the individual and the community conform to the Torah's standards. And this will allow for the community to function well, to live in safety, and to be a holy society. Because what is the purpose of us being a holy society? That God can dwell among us, that we become a home to our heavenly King so that he can also dwell with us. So again, that's why you need judges and officers, so they can make sure that the people are complying with what the Torah establishes or instructs. And the police or the officers help enforce the institutions and the advice of the judges. It's important to know that. And so you have to remember that a perfect society would be one that follows Torah at all the levels, in government, in politics, in education, in welfare for the people and the community. It's an all-around part of the people. Verse 19, so now it's the word is speaking directly to the judges and officers. You are not to twist justice. You must not show partiality or take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts the word of the righteous. Justice you must pursue. Now in the Hebrew it says zedek. Sometimes they translate righteousness as justice and justice as righteousness, but in the Hebrew it says tzedek, which means righteousness. It says you must pursue. And for those of you that have any lawyer friends or any attorneys, this is the motto of the lawyers: justice, justice, you must pursue, even though today probably not many of them are doing that. It says, so that you may live and possess the land that Adonai your God is giving you. So this is part of living in the land and living for a long time. It says, you are not to plant for yourself an Asherah pole of any kind of wood beside the altar of Adonai your God that you make for yourself. So now the word is going to start dealing with a whole bunch of things that would be considered idolatry. Because you have to understand that idolatry would bring chaos to a society that's supposed to be living in accordance with the Torah. So it says, you're not to have an Asherah pole. What is an Asherah pole? This is what usually is called the trees that the people during that time would use to do idolatrous acts. Okay, so any tree, that's why, and I think I've mentioned this before, in the temple of the Lord, you're not supposed to have trees. You're not supposed to plant trees. Why? Because this can be misunderstood as being some of these Asherah trees or some of these trees for idolatry, to false gods. So, and another thing is that we are the trees of God. We are the trees of righteousness planted in the temple of the Lord. And so it's not any kind of tree. We're not supposed to have trees, but we know that if you go to the Temple Mount today, there's trees all over the place. Why? Because the Muslims have planted them knowing that this is against Torah. So it says, you're not to plant for yourself an Asherah pole of any kind of wood beside the altar of Adonai your God that you may make for yourself, nor are you to set up a pillar for yourself. Adonai your God hates this. Why? Because these were things that the people would worship. Now, when you're reading about Abraham, you know that Abraham, when he made a covenant with Abimelech, he planted a tree, but that was a tree as a memorial of the covenant. And even Jacob, after he walked in the wilderness and he had that dream about the temple, he put a pillar of stones again, but that was a memorial. One thing is a memorial, and another thing that you use these things to worship them like idols. So just to make sure that people don't misunderstand, God just says, don't plant anything and don't put up any pillars. Okay, just to make sure that none of these things are for idolatry. And then we go to chapter 17. In chapter 17, it's going to be talking about witnesses and how to deal when investigating an issue that has to do with idolatry. It says, verse 1, you are not to sacrifice to Adonai your God a bull or a sheep that has a defect or anything bad, for that would be an abomination to Adonai your God. What we need to understand is that the animal with the blemish is not an abomination. What's going to be the abomination is that you give that animal that has a defect as a gift to God. Okay, so the problem is not the animal. The problem is you giving to God something that is not the best. It's your intention that you do with that animal. So again, an animal that has a defect or anything bad with it physically is an abomination to Adonai your God. It says, suppose there is found in your midst within one of your gates that Adonai your God is giving you, a man or woman who does what is evil in the eyes of Adonai your God by transgressing his covenant. So in other words, what he's saying is that transgression of the covenant is done with idolatry. If a person commits idolatry of any form, that individual is breaking the covenant. This person, verse 3, this person goes and serves other gods and worships them, the sun or moon or any of the heavenly hosts, which I have not commanded. Today, that is known as astrology, not astronomy, astrology, because astronomy is the science that studies the heavens. It's a science. Astrology is when they use the heavens to try to figure out signs of future events and life destiny and all these things. If you are in covenant with the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your future is in his hands. You have to not worry about what's going to happen to you. You don't have to look up at the stars to say, okay, what's going to happen tomorrow in my life or 10 years from now. God is the one that is in charge of your life. Verse 4. It is told to you, and you have heard about it, and you investigate thoroughly, and indeed it is true, and the thing certain. This abomination has been done in Israel. In other words, if there's someone who has committed idolatry, for example, worshiping the sun and practicing astrology and all these things, he says you just can't accuse them without doing a thorough investigation, making sure that this is true. Verse 5, then you are to bring out to your gates that man or woman who has done this evil thing, and stone that man or woman with stones to death. By the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, the one who is to die is to be put to death. So you find out that this is true, it has been investigated. Not only, you need more than 2 witnesses, at least 2 or more than 2. Why? Because these witnesses are going to be taken separately. They're going to be questioned, and if this matter is true, all the witnesses should be saying the same thing, okay? It's to avoid false witnessing. It says, by the word of 2 or 3 witnesses, the one who is to die is to be put to death. No one is to be put to death by the word of 1 witness. The hand of the witnesses is to be first to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people. So you are to purge the evil from your midst. So if let's say that 2 people here accuse somebody of something, it would be the responsibility of those witnesses to be the first ones to throw the stone to try to kill that individual. Now, if you are falsifying what you said and someone is killed innocently because of false witness, guess what's going to happen to those false witnesses? Then they're going to be punished with the same punishment. Verse 8. Suppose a matter arises that is too, now it's going back to the judges. Now these other verses from 8 forward is in reference to the judges. It says, suppose a matter arises that is too hard for you to judge, over bloodshed, legal claims, or assault, matters of controversy within your gates. Then you should go up to the place Adonai your God chooses, which is Jerusalem, and come to the Levitical Kohanim, or the priest, and the judge in charge at that time. And you will inquire, and they will tell you the sentence of judgment. One thing we need to understand about the judicial system in Israel, at least the way the Torah describes it, there were 3 groups of judges. You had your local judges, which these were within the tribes or within the cities or within the towns, and they were 3, okay? If these 3 judges have an issue, like it's explaining here, you cannot determine how the sentence, you don't know what to do with it, you cannot make up a decision that's just, then you go to the place that God put his name, which is Jerusalem. And in Jerusalem, around the temple, as people came into the temple building, to the first entrance, there was what's called the Sanhedrin, or Sanhedrin, however you want to say it, Katan. The Sanhedrin Katan means small or lesser. So there was a group of judges that were lesser than the Sanhedrin per se. Okay, and the Sanhedrin, which was the major group of judges. So this one, the smaller Sanhedrin, had 23 judges. And then the big one, which would be like the Supreme Court. For us, it would be like the Supreme Court that came with the final judgment or sentence, depending on the issues. This Sanhedrin consisted of 70 plus 1, which was a total of 71 judges. This one that's left aside is what's called the president or the Nasi. The Nasi was in charge of the Sanhedrin. So if there was a lock between the judges that no one could come to a conclusion, let's say there's 70, let's say 35 said no and 35 said yes, then it would be the responsibility of the Nasi to break that tie, okay? But the Nasi never participated in making a judgment. He was there in case he needed to break a tie if none of these 70 could come up with a decision. Now these judges, all of them, whether they were 3, 23, or 71, they were all chosen by God in the sense that in the Torah, God gives them the authority. They were men that were righteous, that were just, that knew the Torah. They understood all the commandments. They were able to apply the commandments according to the issues that the people brought. You remember when Moses was judging the people and his father-in-law said, you're going to go nuts because you're dealing with all the issues of the people, you yourself. He said, break them up into groups. And that's where you got the 70 men. Those 70 men were to help Moses help with the judgment of all the issues that the people brought. Now, one thing we have to understand that all these issues that are judged are all based on Torah. If it has nothing to do with Torah, then that will be taken to the civil judges, the civil courts outside the Sanhedrin. Okay? For example, when Yeshua was crucified, it was part of the religious leaders that complained to the Sanhedrin, but because they were living under the ruling of the Romans, they had no legal authority to kill anybody or to crucify anyone. Crucifixion was a mode of killing a Roman way, not the Jewish way. But because they were under Roman rule, they didn't have the authority. So what did they do? They wanted to get rid of Yeshua. They complained to Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate, remember, he didn't want to do away with Yeshua either, but because all the people were against Yeshua, not all the people. Let me reword that. The religious leaders want to get rid of Yeshua. They were able to bring a complaint to the Roman lawyers or the Roman court, and then the Roman court was the one that decided to eventually crucify Yeshua. Because the Sanhedrin did not have that power, because that was something that had to do with Roman law and not with Jewish law. Okay, so Yeshua, because we know who crucified Yeshua, who put the nails in his arms and feet? The Romans. It was not the Jews. Okay, because they were under Roman rule. So what I'm trying to say is that the Sanhedrin is only to deal with issues that have to do with Torah, all the commandments and all the laws and all the rulings of Torah. And these people consisted of Israelis, men, Jewish men that were chosen. They had to have certain standards, plus Levites and priests, because it has to do with Torah. And if you remember, over 45% of the commandments in the Torah has to do with the temple. So if there was issues of temple, for example, issues of impurity or issues of an animal or something, then they would bring that to the judges that were Levites and priests, because they understood the Torah. Okay, so this has to do only with Torah, nothing else civil. If you had a problem with a neighbor because they busted your car, or you have a ticket, or you have a problem with, that has nothing to do with Torah. Those are issues of the community, and then you would take it to the courts that would deal with that. Okay. And so it says, verse 10, you are to act according to the sentence they tell you from that place Adonai chooses, and take care to do all that they instruct you. In other words, whatever judgments these judges made, you had to follow it. You have to remember that they are the experts in Torah law. You are to act according to the instruction they teach you and the judgment they tell you. You must not turn aside from the sentence they tell you to the right or to the left. The man who acts presumptuously by not listening to the Cohen, to the priest, who stands to serve there before Adonai your God, or to the judge, that man must die. Now that's in reference to a judge. If there's one of the judges that goes against the supreme law or judgment of the Supreme Sanhedrin, that judge needs to be taken out. You cannot go against the rulings of what already has been decided by the Torah. It says you are to purge that evil from Israel. Then all the people will hear and be afraid and not act presumptuously again. So this is all related to leadership and the judicial part of Israel. Now it's going to talk about the kings. Verses 14 in chapter 17 through 20, dealing with the monarchy, with the king. It says, or what we would call today the executive branch, which would be our president, right? It says, when you come to the land that Adonai your God is giving you, possess it and dwell in it, and you say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations around me, you will indeed set over yourselves a king whom Adonai your God chooses. So God is the one that has to choose this king. And how does he do it? He does it through a prophet. You have to remember that when Saul was chosen, it was through Samuel that anointed him. And then David was chosen through Samuel, who also anointed David. And then Solomon was chosen through Nathan. Nathan or Nathan anointed Solomon. So it's always through the hands of a prophet that the king is anointed and chosen. Okay, but God has to be the one chosen. He says, okay, you want a king? It's not that God is against having kings, earthly kings for Israel, but it says you can have one, the one that I choose. Okay, and after I choose, this is what he has to do. It says, you will indeed set over yourselves a king whom Adonai your God chooses. One from among your brothers will be appointed as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. So that's the first rule. Well, the second has to be chosen by God. Number two, cannot be a foreigner. Has to be is born Israeli, a Jew from the land of Israel, born among their brothers. Number three, only he should not multiply horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to multiply horses. In other words, cannot have too many horses. Why? Horses imply power, and to make sure that the king doesn't think that his power comes from the horses instead of knowing that his power comes from God. And why Egypt? Because during this time, the land that had the best horses, that sold the best horses to kings for armies and for the kings was Egypt. And so when he says not to make the people return to Egypt to multiply horses, basically is you cannot permanently go back to live in Egypt. You can go temporarily, you can go visit, but you come back. You cannot stay forever. Because Adonai has said to you, you must never go back that way again. And what it implies is permanently. Okay, you could go visit Egypt, or they could go get horses, but they could not stay there forever. Verse 17, another thing that the king could not do, nor should he multiply wives for himself, that his heart does not turn aside, nor multiply much silver and gold for himself. So he couldn't have many wives. You also have to understand that during that time, the kings tended to have many wives because it was covenants. As they made covenants with different nations, they would acquire wives because then they would have children. And so they kind of thought, okay, if my kids are your grandkids or family, it's less likely you'll come and fight against us and have war against us, because you're going to go have war against your own family, your own relatives. So it's more like a political thing to have wives from different nations. But he says, don't do that. Why? Because if you have wives from different nations, what's going to happen? They're going to bring their culture and their gods, and that's going to make you probably do the same thing that they do. And it says not to accumulate a lot of silver and gold. Why? Because that would be greed. A king with a lot of money that does not give to the people is not a king that's just and righteous. And then he says in verse 18, now when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself a copy of this Torah on a scroll from what is before the Levitical Kohanim. In other words, he has to make a copy, has to have a copy of the Torah exactly the way that the priests and Levites have in the temple. It will remain with him, and he will read in it all the days of his life. For what? In order to learn to fear Adonai his God and keep all the words of this Torah and these statutes. Then his heart will not be exalted above his brothers, and he will not turn from the commandment to the right or to the left, so that he may prolong his days in his kingship, he and his sons in the midst of Israel. So all these things that God says, okay, you want a king? I choose the king, but this is what the king has to do. Because this is going to maintain that king in check. In other words, it's going to be responsible before God, to be just, to be righteous, to not oppress, to not do have many wives, many horses, many things that will take his heart away from following God. But we know that that was not the case, especially with Solomon. Solomon did contrary to all of this. He had gazillion horses. He had 1,000 wives. Well, 300 wives and 700 concubines. 1,000. Hello. And we know that all these things eventually turned his heart against God. The most wise man of all the world, of all times, who God blessed so much, at the end of his life, he turned against the covenant. And we know that because of that, the kingdom was broken. We had the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now, God did not allow that to happen during the time of Solomon because of the love and covenant that he had made with David. So he waited until Solomon died, and then Solomon's son became king, and that's when God allowed the breaking of the nation into two kingdoms. Okay. But had he done the things the way it had to be, we'd probably still be living under the kingship of God. But eventually it'll happen again with Yeshua. Now, chapter 18 now deals with the religious branch, or with the spiritual leadership. It says in verse 1, the Levitical Kohanim, or priests, all the tribe of Levi, are to have no portion or inheritance with Israel. You have to remember that the Levites and the priests did not get a portion of land like the rest of the tribes. It says they are to eat the offerings made by Adonai by fire as his inheritance, because God is their inheritance. So what that part of that chapter is saying is that the Levites and the priests, when they serve, you have to remember that the Levitical families were divided in 24 groups. And those groups had a roster, and they would rotate every so often and serve in the temple. So anytime that family of that priest or that Levite served, all the offerings that was made during that week that they're serving, the bread from the showbread that was exchanged every Shabbat, first fruits, and all the things that were brought into the temple, the priests that were working that week would get that. That would be a way of supporting them and supporting their families, because once they finish that job for that week, they go back home and take with them whatever they received, whether it was meat or fruits or produce or whatever, because that was a way of compensating them. So what it's saying here is that everybody got a fair share of it. In verses 9 through 14 of chapter 18, it talks about things that God hates because it has to do with idolatry. Verse 9 of chapter 18 says, when you enter the land Adonai your God is giving you, you are not to learn to do the abominations of these nations. There must not be found among you anyone who makes his son or daughter pass through the fire, or a fortune teller, a soothsayer, an omen reader, or sorcerer, or one who casts spells, or a medium, or a spiritist, or one who calls up the dead. Now, all these kind of people existed during the time, and still some of them exist today. He says, why this is an abomination? Why? Because the purpose of all these people that do these things is to try to know the future. Not only know the future, but they would try to know the destinies of the people. And so when people had an issue, they needed guidance, they needed an advice, they had a problem, they didn't know how to deal with it, they would go to these individuals. And God is telling you, you don't do that. Why? Because I'm the one you should be coming to. It says, for whoever does these things is an abomination to Adonai. And because of these abominations, Adonai your God is driving them out from before you. You are to be blameless. In other words, wholehearted. Tamim, which means complete in mind, spirit, soul, body, completely to God. You're to be blameless before Adonai your God. For these nations which you are about to dispossess, listen to soothsayers and fortune tellers, but as for you, Adonai your God will not allow you to do so. Now, what are all these people? Okay, a fortune teller is someone that tries to know the future. A soothsayer, it depends on the some of the translations. So all these people, basically, some of them try to tell the future, let's say through tarot cards or through reading your hands, your palms, or whatever. Others would try to decipher your future by the seasons, how the seasons change. Others would do it by trying to guess what the clouds were saying. Others would try to use animals, like for example, those that have a flute and would call upon animals, or sometimes you've seen in movies where you got this guy with a flute and the serpent is like staying still. And so all these things, some of them would try to use bones of animals or the livers of animals to try to decipher. It's like some people today use tea leaves and some of these sticks, you throw them and whatever which way they go, you try to read. So God is saying, you don't do none of these crazy things, because you're going to wind up more crazy than what you were. So he says, this is how you deal. This is the way you deal with issues. In other words, you don't go to these people to try to find out a solution or an answer to your problems or an advice or a reason for whatever you need. He says, Adonai your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your midst, from your brothers. To him you must listen. This is just what you asked of Adonai your God in Horeb on the day of the assembly, when saying, I cannot continue to hear the voice of Adonai my God or see this great fire anymore, or I will die. Adonai said to me, they have done well in what they have spoken. I will raise up a prophet like you for them from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. Now, whoever does not listen to my words that this prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. So you don't go and run to these people that are sorcerers or fortune tellers. You go to the prophet that God has chosen. Now, of course, during the time that this was written, there were prophets in the land. And remember that what he's explaining here, that a prophet of God, a true prophet, is the one that's going to speak the words that God puts in this individual. And if that's the case, it's going to be based on what the Torah says. A true prophet of God is never, ever going to go against the Torah. So it says, verse 20, but the prophet so who is this prophet of which Moses is speaking about? That God is going to send, that's going to be like Moses. Who is this prophet? Yeshua. Please go to the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 14. The Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 14 says, when the people saw the sign that Yeshua performed, they began to say, this is most certainly the prophet who is to come into the world. Why? Because they knew what Moses had said, that God had promised a prophet like Moses. So the people are really seeing that this is Yeshua. It says, this is most certainly the prophet who is to come into the world. Now, please go to the book of Acts. The book of Acts, chapter 3, verse 22 and 23. The book of Acts, chapter 3, verse 22 and 23. Speaking about Yeshua, it says, let's start with 21 for context. Heaven must receive him, who's him, Yeshua, until the time of the restoration of all the things that God spoke about long ago through the mouth of his holy prophets. Moses said, Adonai your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. Hear and obey him and all that he shall say to you. And it shall be that every soul that will not listen to that prophet shall be completely cut off from the people. In other words, people that do not listen to the words of Yeshua At one point, they're going to have to deal with the father because they didn't listen. Because he's the prophet that was to come like Moses. And so when there's an issue in your life, there's a situation that you don't know what to do, there's an issue that you can't find solution to it, you run to Yeshua because he's going to give you the words of the Father. He's not going to say anything that is not in the Torah. So it is through the Torah that Yeshua will speak to us through the Holy Spirit and give us a solution to our problems or situations. So going back to Deuteronomy, verse 21. Now, should you say in your heart, how would we recognize the word that Adonai has not spoken? In other words, if someone says they're a prophet and they're really not a prophet, and they say something like, God told me to tell you. How do you know if this is true or not? It says, when a prophet speaks in Adonai's name and the word does not happen or come true, that is a word that Adonai has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. Do not be afraid of him. In other words, if someone comes and speaks to you something that they say, oh, God told me, and it's not true, it is not going to happen. Because remember that a true prophet of God is going to speak only what the Torah says. If it does not align with Torah, which means that you have to know Torah to know if that individual is what he's telling you goes in alignment or not. If you don't know Torah, they can tell you whatever lie and you're going to believe it. So to be able to know who is a true prophet, they have to speak what the Torah says. Chapter 19 talks about the cities of refuge. Now, we've talked about that in previous portions, and we know that the issue is that when someone accidentally kills another person, that person that killed the other one accidentally has a place to go to find refuge. Why? To avoid being killed by the family of the person that was killed accidentally. So if it's an accidental death by negligence, for example, then the individual has a place to go for refuge. And the purpose of the refuge city is the judges, they make judgment, they get all the information, they get all the witnesses. And if it's true that there was an accident, then that individual stays there until the high priest dies. And in a way, even though it was an accident, in a way, this is kind of like a partial confinement, because that individual cannot leave that city of refuge, doesn't have full liberties to do whatever he wants because of what had happened. It's different from someone that kills another person intentionally. Any murder that has been intentional, that individual is judged and the sentence is death. Okay, so this is in reference to people that accidentally kill somebody. To avoid being killed by the family, because if it was an accident and the individual gets killed by the family of the dead person, then you're killing an innocent person because it was an accident. So to avoid that, remember that the topic of this Torah portion is justice and righteousness, looking always towards justice and righteousness. And then in chapter 20 talks about when men go to war. And it's going to bring a set of different issues in which men are exempted from going to war. And the purpose is to avoid men that are really afraid of war or are a little bit cowardly. Instead of saying it, completely, calling someone a coward, they put a certain situation so that way you can go out of serving through those situations. It says, why? Because if you have men that are afraid and they're at war, these men are not going to help you and they're going to influence all the other people. So you need people that are going to help you and not make you lose the war. It says, when you go out to battle against your enemies and see horse and chariot, a people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For Adonai your God, the one who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you draw near to the battle, the Cohen, the priest, will come forward and speak to the people. He will say to them, hear, O Israel, you are drawing near today to the battle against your enemies. Don't be faint-hearted. Don't fear or panic or tremble because of them. For Adonai your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. The officers are to speak to the troops saying, so these are all the different issues where a man can be exempted from going to battle. What man has built a new house but has not dedicated it? Let him go back to his house, otherwise he might die in the battle and another man will dedicate it. Why? Because you have to rejoice in the blessing of a new house. So he says you need to enjoy that and dedicate your house, do a dedication. Verse 6, what man has planted a vineyard but has not put it to use? Let him go back to his house, otherwise he might die in the battle and another man would begin to use it. Again, the labor, you labor for this vineyard and you haven't enjoyed the fruit of the blessing of the vineyard. So he says, go back, enjoy it. What man has become engaged to a woman but has not married her? Let him go back to his house, otherwise he might die in the battle and another man would marry her. So a man that is married, let's say recently married, you have to understand that in the Jewish mindset, a honeymoon is a whole year, it's 12 months. So a man that's married, it's during this period of the first year of marriage, they're already exempted from war. But this one is betrothed. So he says, go and enjoy your betrothed. Get married, enjoy having family and whatever. So, but if he's married, he's not even goes to war for the first year of marriage. So this is the guy that's betrothed. Verse 8, the officers will speak further to the troops and say, what man, now they come to the issue of what man is afraid and faint-hearted. In other words, they gave the previous issue, so if there was somebody that was afraid, they could use the previous excuses. Oh, I have a vineyard. Oh, I have a new house. Oh, I'm betrothed. And that way they could be exempted instead of saying, oh, I'm afraid. Or to avoid what? Shaming that individual. It says, let him go back to his house so he does not weaken his brother's heart like his own. Verse 9, then when the officers have finished speaking to the troops, they should appoint army commanders at the head of the troops. When you go near a city to fight against it, call out shalom to it. Now you have to understand that this is going to be cities that Israel is going to conquer that are not within the Canaanite nations. These are cities or nations outside the Canaanites. Okay. Why? Because already they were given an order that the Canaanites you had to destroy completely. But if these are nations that are not within the Canaanites and you're going to conquer their cities, the first thing you have to do is ask them for peace. And if they accept your peace, then you do a covenant and these people become your servants. Okay, they pay tribute to you. But if you offer peace and they say, no, we don't want you guys here, then they go to war and Israel's to kill all the males, but they can take the women and the children and the animals as part of their booty. Okay. But it says, go to verse 16 of chapter 20. However, only from the cities of these peoples, which Adonai your God is giving you as an inheritance, you must not let anything that breathe live. So these are the Canaanite nations. Why? Because out of those nations is that they're going to inherit the land. It says you must utterly destroy them. This is cherem, when something's dedicated to God for destruction. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all the ites, just as Adonai your God has commanded you. You are to do this so they will not teach you to do all the abominations as they have done for their gods, and so you would sin against Adonai your God. In other words, all these nations have to be completely, utterly destroyed, because if they let them live, they're going to be a snare unto the people of Israel. It says, when you lay, verse 19, when you lay siege to a city for a long time, making war against it to capture it, you are not to destroy its trees by swinging an axe at them. For from them you may eat, so you shall not chop them down. In other words, talking about the fruit trees. If you go to a place You're going to conquer. Says, don't destroy the fruit trees. Why? Because you're going to eat of them. They're going to serve as food. For is the tree of the field human that you should enter the siege before you? In other words, why destroy nature when it's not nature that's against you, it's the people. So leave the trees alone. Unless you know if the tree doesn't give fruit, you can use that wood, let's say for housing or for building things. It says you may destroy and chop down only the trees that you know are not trees for food, so that you may build siege equipment against a city that is making war with you until its downfall. Because you have to remember that when they went to conquer other places, that wasn't done overnight. Sometimes they could be there a year, 2 years. So if you're going to be you're doing a siege around a city and you're going to be there 2 years, you're going to eat of those fruit trees. You're going to use some of the wood to make houses. You're going to use to make ramps. But you just can't chop down trees because you're mad against the city. Don't burn them. Don't destroy them. Okay. And then in chapter 21, part of chapter 21, what it's talking about is a ritual when innocent blood is shed. And what it's saying is when let's say someone is walking through the field and they find someone that has been murdered. First of all, you have to understand that the person that they find, that the cause of death was not a natural one, that the person was murdered, but no one knows who did it. So it says, verse 1, suppose a slain person is found fallen in a field on the land Adonai your God is giving you to possess. Who struck him is unknown. Then your elders and judges must come out and measure the distance to the towns that are around the slain one. In other words, they went from where they found the dead person and started measuring to see what is the closest city to that individual, because the logic is that most likely this individual belonged to one of the nearest cities. And the purpose of doing that is by measuring all these places, the word goes out that they found someone that had been slain. They don't know who did it, and trying to give an opportunity to the person that did this act come out and confess, or to let the people know that they know about this issue and that eventually they're going to do an investigation and trying to find out who murdered the individual. Because it just doesn't stop there. Even though they do this ritual in a way to kind of clean their hands from innocent blood, they're still going to try to find out who killed the individuals. Like when sometimes we hear about cold cases in the police, that they never find out who, and then maybe many years later they find out what happened. So they still trying to find out the cause of the death, or who killed the individual. Verse 3, now the town nearest to the slain one, the elders of that city are to take from the herd a heifer that has not been used for work or pulled a yoke, similar to the red heifer. Then the elders of that city are to bring the heifer down to a flowing valley that has not been plowed or sown, and break the heifer's neck there in the valley. In other words, they're going to go to a place where that land has never been sown, has never been reaped. In a word, a land that has never given any fruit. And they're going to take this baby cow or young cow. They're going to break its neck, not slaughter it. It's not an offering, and it's not to be slaughtered in a kosher way. It's slaughtered in a way to make sure that it's killed, but it cannot be eaten. It cannot be used. Why? Because the place that they go to do this ritual, both these things are going to represent the individual that was slain. In what sense? In that this land never fulfilled its potential. It never was sown, it never was reaped, it never gave fruit. The same thing was with the calf. It never was allowed to work. It was never allowed to procreate. In other words, it never fulfilled its potential as a calf. The same way that the individual that was murdered, in other words, its life was taken before time. So this individual neither had a chance to fulfill his potential. In other words, one of the commentaries that I was reading was that a murder can be kind of like a prototype of old sins, in the sense that a murder takes away the potential of an individual fulfilling his mission that God gave to that life. And when we sin, what we're doing basically is taking away the potential in us that God has put for us to fulfill. Sin does not allow us to fulfill completely the mission, the role, the purpose, the potential that God puts in each and every one of us. So part of the land and part of the calf represents this individual that was taken away sooner than his natural death. And it says, verse 5, the Kohanim, the priests, the sons of Levi will come forward, for Adonai your God has chosen them to serve him and pronounce blessings in his name, and by their mouth every dispute and assault is to be settled. All the elders of that city nearest to the slain one will wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the body. Then they will answer and say, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see. Grant atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, Adonai, and do not put innocent blood on your people Israel. Then atonement will be granted to them for the blood. So you will purge the guilt of innocent blood from your midst when you do what is right in Adonai's sight. So the purpose is to do something on behalf of that innocent blood that was shed. Why? Because one of the things that God wants to avoid is that in the land, innocent blood be shed. Why? Because the righteous thing is to maintain justice and righteousness. So all these laws that Moses is speaking that have to do with the leaders, with the judges, with the officers, with the king, with the priests, with the Levites, they're all responsible to make sure that the justice and righteousness of which the Torah speaks is done by the individual and the whole community, because that is the only way that God is going to live within that community among the people, if righteousness and justice are kept, if there's no oppression, if there's no injustice, if there's no unrighteousness, if people are mistreated, if people are killed innocently just because it's the fun of it. Okay, so it's to maintain order according to the Torah. And just a few words about the month of Elul before we go into questions. Remember that we just started the month of Elul. Elul is the 6th month within the Hebrew calendar, counting from Aviv. And Elul is 40 days of Teshuvah. Teshuvah means returning to God. Some people translate it as repentance, but it's more than just repentance. It's returning to him, to the center, to the focus, to the source of life. And during these 40 days, we're in preparation for the fall feast, especially Yom Kippur, because we know that on the 1st of Tishri, which is the next month after Elul, which is Rosh Hashanah, which is Yom Teruah, starts what's called the time of judgment. Because you have to remember that from the 1st of Tishri to the 10th of Yom Kippur, the 10th, which is Tishri, Yom Kippur, is what's called the 10 days of awe. The heavenly courts are opened, the books are open, and there is judgment. So the Teshuvah is returning to God. These 40 days is a time of reflection, introspection, to see our hearts, to see where we have failed God, to see how we have done since last Yom Kippur to this new coming Yom Kippur. It's a time of asking for forgiveness. It's a time of confession. And some of the customs that we do during Elul is that every day we blow the shofar, because the shofar is to awaken the people to come into teshuvah, and to repentance, and to confession, and to recognizing the wrong things that we have done. Also, another custom is during these 40 days to proclaim Psalm 27. Psalm 27 is declared every single day during these 40 days. Another thing is, for the month of Teshuvah, is there's a set of prayers that are said, which are called selichot. And these are prayers of asking of forgiveness. They're prayers of confession. And it's a whole list and includes a whole bunch of Psalms. And so these are said also every day until we get to Yom Kippur. So ELUL is the, in Hebrew, ELUL is the letter Aleph, Lamed, Vav, and Lamed. And these are the initials of the phrase that I'm sure you've heard, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Well, ELUL in Hebrew, the letters Aleph, Lamed, Vav, Lamed have to do with the first letter of those words in Hebrew. Why? Because ELUL is the time that we approach our beloved. We approach him with confession. We approach him with repentance. And so he forgives us and brings us back to him. Another thing, one of the things they say about ELUL is that the king is out in the field. The king comes out to meet the people. If you know anything about kingship, usually it's very hard to see the king. It's like very hard to go see the president. It's like if the president all of a sudden decides to come to Brandon and meet everybody, giving an opportunity to ask him questions, to talk to him. So in this case, the king comes and approaches the people, giving the opportunity to all peoples to come and approach and meet the king. So those are some of the things that ELUL is related to. It's a time when God approaches us so we can come to him without any fear and be with trust and confidence, say what's in our hearts, asking for forgiveness, because that's what's going to help us come into Yom Kippur ready, prepared for this for the service of Yom Kippur, because it's a time of judgment. We have to remember that judgment is going to be either favorable or unfavorable, depending on in which of the books our name is written. Now, because of Messiah Yeshua, our name should be in the book of life. So we know that through Messiah, he will forgive us. Okay, so this is the month of ELUL. We just started Wednesday evening at sunset with the new moon of ELUL. This is the 6th month within the Hebrew calendar, starting from Aviv. Tishri, or the 1st of Tishri, which is Rosh Hashanah, Yom Teruah, this year is going to start in the evening of September 18. It's a Friday, so that September 18 is going to be the new moon of Tishri. It's going to be Yom Teruah. It's going to be Rosh Hashanah, which is the new year, civil new year for the Jews. It's going to be a Shabbat. So it's full of blessings. That day is going to be powerful. So September 18 in the evening is going to be all that. And then 10 days later, and my sister's birthday, that's, and then 10 days later, from the 27th through the 28th of September is Yom Kippur. Okay, I'm thinking that maybe I'm going to try to see if we can set up for a mikvah, to go do a mikvah. Last year, I don't think we had a chance to do it, but I'm going to see how we can manage and maybe have a mikvah before Yom Kippur. Okay, so with that said, let's go for some questions.